The 911 call came in at 6:23 a.m. on October 8, 2024, to the McLennan County Sheriff's Office from a construction crew working on a highway expansion project along Interstate 35, approximately 12 miles south of Waco, Texas, in the rolling hill country that stretches between the Brazos River and the Balcones Escarpment. The workers had been clearing vegetation and conducting soil surveys for the new highway lanes when their equipment operator noticed what appeared to be human remains, partially buried beneath an old concrete culvert that had been hidden by dense mesquite brush and wild oak trees for decades. Among the items recovered were a tarnished silver class ring from Baylor University bearing the year 2000, fragments of clothing including denim and what appeared to be a sorority t-shirt, and most significantly, a Texas driver's license in the name of Jennifer Lynn Hartwell, issued in January 2000 to a 23-year-old resident of Waco, Texas. Jennifer Hartwell had been 23 years old when she disappeared on the evening of June 15, 2000, after leaving her job as a marketing coordinator at a local telecommunications company in downtown Waco, where she had been working since graduating from Baylor University with a degree in business administration just 3 weeks earlier. Jennifer was known throughout her sorority, Alpha Delta Pi, and among her co-workers for her infectious optimism, her dedication to community service projects, and her ambitious plans to eventually start her own marketing consulting firm that would specialize in helping small businesses in rural Texas communities develop their brand identities and reach new customers through emerging internet technologies. The evening Jennifer vanished had been a typical Thursday night, with her planning to meet friends at a popular restaurant near the Baylor campus to celebrate her recent job promotion and discuss plans for a weekend trip to Austin, where several sorority sisters were living while pursuing graduate degrees or beginning their professional careers. Jennifer had stayed late at her office to finish preparing a presentation for the following day's client meeting, leaving the downtown building around 8:45 p.m. and walking to her car, a 1998 Honda Civic, which was parked in a well-lit lot adjacent to the office building where security cameras monitored employee vehicles throughout the night. When Jennifer failed to arrive at the restaurant by 9:30 p.m., her friends became concerned because punctuality was one of her defining characteristics, and she always called if she was going to be more than 15 minutes late for any appointment. Her sorority sister and best friend, Michelle Rodriguez, tried calling Jennifer's cell phone repeatedly, but received no answer, which was unusual because Jennifer was meticulous about returning calls and staying in communication with friends and family members. By 10:15 p.m., Michelle had driven to Jennifer's apartment complex, the Oakwood Gardens, and discovered that Jennifer's car was not in her assigned parking space and that her apartment lights were off, suggesting that she had never made it home from work. The search for Jennifer Hartwell began officially on the morning of June 16th, when her supervisor at the telecommunications company, David Patterson, called police to report that Jennifer had missed an important client meeting without any explanation, and that her absence was completely uncharacteristic of someone who had been one of the company's most reliable and dedicated employees. Patterson explained that Jennifer had been excited about the presentation she was preparing and had specifically mentioned her plans to arrive early to ensure that all materials were properly organized and that the conference room technology was functioning correctly for her PowerPoint slides. Jennifer's Honda Civic was discovered later that same day by Waco police officers conducting a routine patrol of shopping center parking lots throughout the city, checking for abandoned vehicles that might be connected to the missing person report. The car was found in the parking lot of a strip mall on Valley Mills Drive, approximately 4 miles from Jennifer's office building and in an area that she would not normally have visited, especially after dark. The vehicle was locked, with no signs of forced entry. But Jennifer's purse, cell phone, and the presentation materials she had been preparing were missing from the car's interior, while her spare car keys were found under the front seat, suggesting that someone else had driven the vehicle to its final location. Detective Sarah Chen of the Waco Police Department was assigned as lead investigator when Jennifer's case was classified as a suspected abduction on June 17th, after initial searches of the area around the strip mall failed to locate any trace of Jennifer or her personal belongings. Chen was a 7-year veteran with specialized training in crimes against women and had recently completed additional coursework in missing person investigations at the FBI's training facility in Quantico, Virginia. Chen immediately recognized the significance of the location where Jennifer's car was found, noting that the strip mall was situated near several major highways that could have been used to transport Jennifer out of the McLennan County area quickly and with minimal risk of detection by local law enforcement. Jennifer Hartwell was the youngest daughter of Thomas and Patricia Hartwell, longtime residents of Richardson, Texas, a suburb north of Dallas, where Thomas worked as an engineer for Texas Instruments and Patricia taught high school mathematics. The Hartwell family had relocated to Richardson when Jennifer was in middle school, moving from a small town in East Texas, where Thomas had worked for an oil company and where Patricia had been a stay-at-home mother, involved in church activities and community volunteer organizations. Jennifer had thrived academically and socially at Richardson High School, where she was student council president, captain of the debate team, and valedictorian of her graduating class, earning a full academic scholarship to Baylor University that made her parents extremely proud of her achievements and potential. The family's life before Jennifer's disappearance had been characterized by stability, achievement, and strong religious faith that was centered around their membership in the First Baptist Church of Richardson. Jennifer's older sister, Rebecca, had graduated from the University of Texas at Austin 3 years earlier and was working as a pediatric nurse in Dallas while planning her wedding to her college boyfriend, a physical therapist who shared the family's commitment to service and community involvement. Jennifer often expressed admiration for Rebecca's career choice and her dedication to helping children, though Jennifer's own interests were focused on business and entrepreneurship rather than health care or education. Jennifer's high school years had been marked by exceptional academic performance, leadership activities, and volunteer work that demonstrated her commitment to helping others and improving her community. She had organized fundraising campaigns for local charities, served as a peer tutor for struggling students, and participated in mission trips to Mexico, where she helped build homes for low-income families while practicing the Spanish language skills she had developed through advanced coursework. Jennifer's teachers consistently described her as mature beyond her years, compassionate toward others, and possessed of exceptional organizational and communication abilities that made her a natural leader among her classmates. During her time at Baylor University, Jennifer had excelled academically while maintaining an active social life and pursuing internship opportunities that provided practical experience in marketing and business administration. She had completed internships with 3 different companies during summer breaks, including a position with a Dallas advertising agency that had offered her a full-time job upon graduation, though she ultimately chose to remain in Waco to gain additional experience with the telecommunications company before eventually pursuing her entrepreneurial goals. Jennifer's professors remembered her as an exceptionally bright and motivated student who consistently produced high-quality work and who showed genuine interest in applying theoretical concepts to real-world business challenges. The disappearance of Jennifer Hartwell generated significant media coverage throughout Central Texas and beyond, partly because of her recent graduation from Baylor University, and partly because the case represented concerns about the safety of young professional women living independently in college towns where the transient population and nightlife created potential risks that were not always adequately addressed by local law enforcement agencies. The story was featured prominently in the Waco Tribune-Herald, on television news programs throughout Texas, and eventually gained national attention when it was covered by CNN and featured in a segment on America's Most Wanted that generated hundreds of tips from viewers across the country. The initial investigation focused on Jennifer's co-workers, classmates, and the various men she had dated during her time at Baylor University, with Detective Chen conducting extensive interviews to identify anyone who might have harbored romantic interests or professional jealousies that could have motivated an attack. Chen discovered that Jennifer had recently ended a casual dating relationship with Brad Morrison, a graduate student in Baylor's MBA program, but found no evidence that Morrison had reacted negatively to the breakup or had any involvement in Jennifer's disappearance. Morrison had been in Dallas visiting his family on the evening Jennifer vanished, with multiple witnesses confirming his alibi and no signs of deceptive behavior during his interviews with investigators. Detective Chen also investigated the possibility that Jennifer's disappearance might be connected to her work at the telecommunications company, where she had access to sensitive customer information and billing records that could have been valuable to competitors or criminals involved in identity theft and financial fraud. Chen learned that Jennifer had recently discovered irregularities in several customer accounts and had reported her concerns to management, potentially creating a motive for someone to silence her before she could provide information to law enforcement or regulatory agencies. However, Chen's investigation of the company's employees and business relationships failed to identify credible suspects or evidence of criminal activity that would explain Jennifer's disappearance. The investigation was complicated by the rapid growth and development occurring throughout the Waco area in 2000, with new construction projects, highway expansions, and commercial developments, creating hundreds of potential locations where Jennifer could have been taken and where evidence could have been buried or disposed of in areas that would not be disturbed for years or decades. Detective Chen coordinated with Texas Department of Transportation officials to identify construction sites and development projects that had been active during the relevant time period, but the scope of potential search areas was overwhelming for the resources available to local law enforcement agencies. As summer turned to fall, without any significant breakthroughs in the case, investigators began exploring the possibility that Jennifer's disappearance might be connected to a series of attacks on young women that had occurred throughout Central Texas during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Chen consulted with detectives from Austin College Station and other university towns to compare case details and identify potential patterns, but found no conclusive connections between Jennifer's disappearance and other unsolved crimes, though several cases involved similar circumstances, with professional women who had vanished after leaving work or social events during evening hours. The case took on additional complexity when investigators learned that Jennifer had been receiving anonymous phone calls during the weeks preceding her disappearance, calls that made her uncomfortable, though she had not reported them to police because the caller had never made explicit threats or used profane language. Jennifer's roommate, Lisa Thompson, recalled that Jennifer had mentioned receiving calls from someone who claimed to be conducting marketing surveys, but who asked personal questions about her work schedule, living arrangements, and social activities that seemed inappropriate for legitimate business research. Thompson wished she had encouraged Jennifer to report the calls to police, but both women had assumed the calls were merely annoying rather than potentially dangerous. The investigation into Jennifer's disappearance was further complicated by the limitations of forensic technology available in 2000, particularly regarding DNA analysis and cellular phone tracking capabilities that would later become standard tools for missing person investigations. Jennifer's cell phone records showed that her last call had been made to her office voicemail system at 8:52 p.m. on the evening she disappeared, but cell tower data was not detailed enough to determine her precise location when the call was made, or where her phone might have been taken after that time. Similarly, the lack of security cameras at most businesses and intersections meant that investigators had very limited video evidence to help trace Jennifer's movements after she left her office building. Detective Chen pursued numerous leads throughout 2000 and 2001, including tips from psychics and self-proclaimed investigators who claimed to have insights about Jennifer's fate, though none of these alternative approaches provided useful information or evidence that advanced the investigation. Chen also coordinated with federal law enforcement agencies to determine whether Jennifer's disappearance might be connected to human trafficking organizations or interstate criminal networks, but found no evidence supporting theories that Jennifer had been transported outside of Texas or that her case was connected to organized criminal activities involving multiple victims or multiple jurisdictions. By the first anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance in June 2001, her case had been unofficially classified as cold, though Detective Chen continued following up on tips and reviewing evidence whenever new information became available. The Hartwell family established a reward fund that eventually reached $100,000 for information leading to Jennifer's recovery, and they worked with missing person advocacy organizations to keep Jennifer's case in the public eye through media appearances, poster campaigns, and internet websites that were becoming increasingly important tools for maintaining awareness of unsolved disappearances. The years following Jennifer's disappearance devastated the Hartwell family and profoundly affected the Baylor University community, which implemented new safety protocols and escort services to address concerns about student and recent graduate safety in the Waco area. Thomas Hartwell took early retirement from Texas Instruments to devote his time to searching for Jennifer, and advocating for improved missing person investigation procedures, while Patricia Hartwell left her teaching position due to anxiety and depression that made it impossible for her to concentrate on her professional responsibilities. The Hartwell family's ordeal was compounded by well-meaning but intrusive media attention, and by periodic false leads that raised their hopes before ultimately proving to be unrelated to Jennifer's case. The impact of Jennifer's disappearance extended beyond her immediate family to her sorority, sisters, classmates, and co-workers who struggled with survivors' guilt and fear that they could have done something to prevent the tragedy, or that they could be potential targets of whoever had harmed Jennifer. Many of Jennifer's friends sought counseling through Baylor University's Student Services or community mental health organizations, while others channeled their grief and anxiety into advocacy work for missing person awareness and campus safety improvements. The Alpha Delta Pi sorority established an annual scholarship in Jennifer's honor and organized regular memorial events that kept her memory alive while raising funds for missing person investigation organizations. Thomas and Patricia Hartwell's marriage endured tremendous strain during the years of uncertainty about Jennifer's fate, with each parent coping with grief and frustration in different ways that sometimes created conflict and emotional distance between them. Thomas became increasingly obsessed with the investigation, spending countless hours reviewing case files, conducting internet research, and following up on tips that often proved to be unfounded or irrelevant. Patricia withdrew from social activities and family relationships, struggling with depression and anxiety that required ongoing medical treatment and that limited her ability to provide emotional support to Thomas or to their older daughter Rebecca, who was dealing with her own grief while trying to build a career and family. The Hartwell family's financial situation was severely impacted by Jennifer's disappearance, with Thomas leaving his lucrative engineering position and the family spending tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators, reward money, and travel expenses related to following up on potential leads in other states. Thus, the family's retirement savings were depleted by investigation-related expenses, forcing them to downsize their home and dramatically alter their plans for their golden years. Despite these financial hardships, the Hartwells never considered abandoning their search for Jennifer or reducing the reward money, believing that someone in the community possessed information that could solve the case if sufficient incentive were provided. Detective Chen retired from the Waco Police Department in 2018, but she maintained personal files on Jennifer's case and continued investigating new leads whenever they became available. Chen had developed strong suspicions about several potential suspects over the years, focusing particularly on individuals who had worked in construction or transportation industries that would have provided them with knowledge of remote locations where bodies could be disposed of and access to heavy equipment that could be used for burial or concealment. Chen believed that Jennifer's killer was likely someone who had encountered her through routine activities rather than someone from her personal or professional circles, making the crime an opportunistic attack, rather than a planned assault by someone who knew her well. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, advances in forensic science and investigative technology periodically raised hopes that Jennifer's case might be solved through new DNA analysis techniques improved database searches, or enhanced digital evidence processing capabilities. Detective Chen submitted evidence from Jennifer's case for reanalysis multiple times as new testing methods became available, though early attempts were unsuccessful due to degradation of biological samples and the limited quality of genetic material that had been preserved from the crime scene. Each negative result was devastating for the Hartwell family, who had hoped that scientific progress would provide the breakthrough needed to identify Jennifer's killer and finally achieve justice. The Baylor University community maintained its commitment to Jennifer's memory through various memorial and awareness programs that honored her life while promoting campus safety and missing person awareness. The business school established an annual Jennifer Hartwell Memorial Lecture Series that brought prominent speakers to campus to discuss entrepreneurship, marketing innovation, and community service, topics that reflected Jennifer's academic interests and career aspirations. The lecture series attracted national attention and helped to maintain public awareness of Jennifer's case while inspiring current students to pursue their goals with the same determination and optimism that had characterized Jennifer's approach to life and education. The breakthrough in Jennifer's case came through advances in forensic genealogy and improved DNA analysis techniques that allowed investigators to develop genetic profiles from degraded evidence that had been considered untestable for over 20 years. In August 2024, criminalists working with the Texas Department of Public Safety were able to extract DNA from hair and skin cells found on Jennifer's car door handle, evidence that had been preserved in climate-controlled storage since 2000 but had been too degraded for analysis using earlier testing methods. The DNA profile was uploaded to genealogical databases, leading to family tree analysis that identified potential relatives of Jennifer's attacker. The genealogical investigation was conducted by specialist companies that had developed expertise in using public DNA databases and historical records to identify suspects in cold cases through comparison of genetic profiles with family members who had voluntarily submitted DNA samples for ancestry research. The process required months of painstaking analysis of family trees, birth records, marriage certificates, and other historical documents to trace genetic relationships and identify individuals who could have been the source of the DNA found in Jennifer's case. The investigation ultimately focused on several family lines in Central Texas, leading to the identification of Kevin James Sullivan as a person of interest who warranted further investigation. The genealogical investigation pointed to Kevin James Sullivan, age 55, a former construction worker and current equipment operator for the Texas Department of Transportation, who had lived in the Waco area for his entire adult life. Sullivan had been 28 years old in 2000, working for a road construction company that had been involved in several projects throughout McLennan County, including highway maintenance work along the routes where Jennifer's car was found and where her remains were eventually discovered. Employment records showed that Sullivan had called in sick on June 16, 2000, the day after Jennifer's disappearance, claiming he was suffering from food poisoning. But medical records showed no doctor visits or prescriptions that would have supported his claimed illness. When investigators reviewed Sullivan's background and criminal history, they discovered a disturbing pattern of arrests for public intoxication, assault, and domestic violence that had never been properly investigated for potential connections to more serious crimes. Court records showed that Sullivan had been arrested multiple times during the late 1990s and early 2000s for incidents involving aggressive behavior toward women, including charges of stalking and harassment that had been reduced to misdemeanors through plea bargaining or dismissed due to witness intimidation. Several ex-girlfriends described Sullivan as controlling, violent, and obsessed with monitoring their activities and relationships with other men. Investigators also discovered that Sullivan had been employed by the same construction company that had been working on road projects near Jennifer's office building during the spring and summer of 2000, providing him with legitimate reasons to be in the downtown Waco area during normal business hours, when he could have observed Jennifer's routines and identified her as a potential target. Construction schedules showed that Sullivan's crew had been working on road repairs and utility installations within 6 blocks of Jennifer's office building during the month preceding her disappearance, and that Sullivan had been assigned to operate heavy equipment that would have required him to work late evening shifts that could have coincided with Jennifer's schedule of staying late at the office to complete work projects. Further investigation revealed that Sullivan had a history of alcohol and substance abuse that had intensified during 2000, leading to increasingly erratic behavior that had concerned his supervisors and co-workers. Employment records showed that Sullivan had received multiple warnings about tardiness, inappropriate behavior toward female co-workers, and violations of workplace safety protocols that suggested he was experiencing personal problems that affected his job performance. Several former co-workers described Sullivan as having an explosive temper and making disturbing comments about women, particularly attractive women who he believed were arrogant or who had rejected his advances. The investigation also revealed that Sullivan had demonstrated extensive knowledge of remote areas throughout Central Texas where bodies could be concealed, knowledge that he had acquired through years of highway construction and maintenance work that required him to survey and work in locations far from populated areas. Sullivan's work assignments had taken him to virtually every rural area of McLennan County and surrounding regions, providing him with intimate familiarity with terrain, access roads, and seasonal conditions that would affect the preservation and discovery of buried remains. Investigators found that Sullivan had specifically worked on projects near the location where Jennifer's body was eventually discovered, including pipeline installation and bridge construction that would have required him to operate heavy excavation equipment in the precise area where her remains were found. On October 15, 2024, exactly 1 week after Jennifer's remains were discovered, Texas Rangers and McLennan County Sheriff's deputies arrested Kevin Sullivan at his home in Woodway, a suburb west of Waco, on charges of murder and aggravated kidnapping. The arrest was conducted by a heavily armed tactical team due to concerns that Sullivan might be armed and dangerous, based on intelligence that he owned multiple firearms and had made threatening statements about law enforcement during previous encounters with police officers. Sullivan initially denied any knowledge of Jennifer Hartwell, claiming that he had never heard her name and had no involvement in her disappearance. But his denials were contradicted by DNA evidence and witness statements that placed him in the vicinity of her office building on the night she vanished. The news of Sullivan's arrest shocked the Waco community, where he had been a familiar figure for over 2 decades through his work on road construction and maintenance projects throughout the region. Sullivan's neighbors and co-workers described him as a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself and who had never caused obvious problems or attracted significant attention from law enforcement in recent years. However, more detailed investigation revealed that Sullivan had a history of alcohol and drug abuse, anger management problems, and predatory behavior toward women that had been overlooked or minimized by supervisors and community members who preferred to avoid confrontation or involvement in workplace and personal disputes. The investigation that followed Sullivan's arrest revealed additional evidence that strengthened the prosecution's case and suggested that he might have committed other crimes against women that had never been solved or properly investigated. Detectives discovered that Sullivan had detailed knowledge of remote areas throughout Central Texas where bodies could be disposed of, knowledge that he had acquired through years of highway construction work that required him to survey and excavate locations far from populated areas. Investigators also found journals and photographs in Sullivan's possession that suggested he had been stalking and monitoring young women in the Waco area for years, maintaining detailed records of their daily routines, work schedules, and social activities. Sullivan's collection of photographs and notes revealed a disturbing pattern of surveillance activities that had targeted numerous young women throughout the Waco area over the course of many years, including current and former Baylor University students, young professionals working in downtown offices, and women employed in retail and service industries that brought them into contact with the general public. The materials found in Sullivan's possession included detailed maps showing the locations of apartment complexes, parking lots, and business districts where young women could be observed and approached, as well as notes describing specific individuals and their daily routines that demonstrated extensive planning and preparation for potential crimes. Sullivan's ex-wife, Maria Santos, provided critical information about his behavior and psychological state during the period when Jennifer disappeared. Maria testified that Sullivan had been drinking heavily and using methamphetamines during 2000, leading to increasingly violent and erratic behavior that had forced her to obtain a restraining order and file for divorce to protect herself and their young daughter. Maria also described Sullivan's obsession with attractive young women and his frequent comments about wanting to teach lessons to women who he believed were arrogant or who rejected his advances. Maria said that Sullivan had seemed unusually nervous and paranoid during the weeks following Jennifer's disappearance, avoiding his usual bars and social gatherings, and becoming angry whenever missing person cases were mentioned in news reports. Maria's testimony also revealed that Sullivan had access to a variety of tools and equipment through his construction work that could have been used to commit and conceal crimes, including rope, duct tape, and various chemicals that could be used to destroy physical evidence. Maria described Sullivan's detailed knowledge of rural areas throughout Central Texas and his familiarity with seasonal patterns that affected access to remote locations, knowledge that he had gained through years of highway and infrastructure construction work. Maria also testified that Sullivan had shown her locations where bodies could be buried without discovery, claiming that his construction experience had taught him how to excavate and conceal graves that would not be found by casual observers or even by trained search teams. The prosecution of Kevin Sullivan was handled by McLennan County District Attorney Josh Tatons, who had extensive experience prosecuting violent crimes and who was determined to secure justice for Jennifer Hartwell and closure for her family after more than 24 years of uncertainty. Tatons's case relied on DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence connecting Sullivan to the crime scene, and testimony from witnesses who could describe his behavior patterns and opportunity to commit the murder. The prosecution also utilized forensic analysis of construction and highway records that demonstrated Sullivan's access to remote areas and heavy equipment that could have been used to bury Jennifer's body in the location where it was eventually discovered. The prosecution's case also included expert testimony about the statistical probability that the DNA found in Jennifer's case belonged to someone other than Sullivan, with forensic scientists explaining that the genetic profile was sufficiently detailed and unique to exclude all other possible sources except for Sullivan or a hypothetical identical twin. DNA experts testified that advances in genetic analysis technology since 2000 had made it possible to extract reliable profiles from biological samples that had been considered too degraded for testing when they were originally collected, and that proper storage and handling procedures had preserved enough genetic material to provide conclusive identification after more than 2 decades. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Sullivan had provided false and contradictory information about his activities and whereabouts during the time period when Jennifer disappeared, including claims about his work schedule and personal activities that were contradicted by employment records and witness statements. Investigators testified that Sullivan had initially claimed to have no memory of the relevant time period due to alcohol and drug use, but later provided detailed alibis that were proven false through documentary evidence and interviews with co-workers and family members. The prosecution argued that Sullivan's changing stories demonstrated consciousness of guilt and awareness that his actual activities during the relevant time period would implicate him in Jennifer's murder. The prosecution also presented evidence about Sullivan's pattern of stalking and surveilling young women in the Waco area, including the photographs and notes found in his possession that demonstrated his obsession with monitoring and controlling women who fit Jennifer's demographic profile. Expert witnesses testified about the psychology of sexual predators and the behavioral patterns that typically precede violent crimes against women, explaining how Sullivan's documented activities represented escalating behavior that would naturally progress to more serious criminal acts. The prosecution argued that Sullivan's surveillance activities demonstrated premeditation and planning that supported charges of kidnapping and murder rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The defense strategy focused on challenging the reliability of DNA evidence that had been stored for over 24 years and arguing that Sullivan's presence in the general area where Jennifer worked was not unusual for someone whose job required him to travel throughout McLennan County for construction projects. Sullivan's attorney, public defender Rebecca Martinez, argued that the DNA sample could have been contaminated during storage or analysis, and that Sullivan's knowledge of remote areas was common among construction workers who had spent decades working on highway and infrastructure projects throughout Central Texas. Martinez also argued that Sullivan's ex-wife's testimony was motivated by personal animosity and financial considerations related to their contentious divorce proceedings. The defense also attempted to present alternative theories about Jennifer's disappearance, suggesting that she could have been the victim of random violence committed by transients or criminals who had since left the area or died from natural causes. Martinez argued that the investigation had been inadequate in exploring other potential suspects and that the focus on Sullivan was the result of confirmation bias rather than genuine evidence of his guilt. The defense presented character witnesses who testified about Sullivan's reputation as a reliable worker and his lack of serious felony convictions, emphasizing his decades of steady employment and his role as a father who had maintained regular contact with his daughter despite his divorce from her mother. Defense experts challenged the prosecution's DNA evidence, arguing that the genetic sample was too old and potentially contaminated to provide reliable results, and suggesting that the laboratory procedures used to analyze the evidence might have produced false positive results due to cross-contamination from other cases or improper handling protocols. Defense witnesses included forensic scientists who testified that DNA degradation over extended time periods could create partial profiles that might match multiple individuals, and that the statistical calculations used to demonstrate the uniqueness of genetic profiles were based on assumptions about population genetics that might not be accurate for individuals of Sullivan's ethnic and geographic background. The defense also argued that Sullivan's collection of photographs and notes did not constitute evidence of criminal activity, claiming that his interest in observing and documenting people was a harmless hobby that reflected social awkwardness rather than predatory intentions. Martinez argued that Sullivan's previous arrests for domestic violence and harassment were not relevant to the charges he faced in Jennifer's case, and that his ex-wife's testimony was unreliable due to her obvious bias and her financial incentives to cooperate with prosecutors who could influence child support and custody arrangements that affected her economic security. The trial began in March 2025 in a McLennan County courthouse that was filled with media representatives, community members, and Baylor University alumni who had maintained interest in Jennifer's case throughout the years. Thomas and Patricia Hartwell, now in their 70s and visibly aged by more than 2 decades of grief and uncertainty, attended every day of the trial, accompanied by Jennifer's older sister and extended family members who had never stopped believing that the truth about Jennifer's fate would eventually be revealed. The Hartwell family had prepared detailed victim impact statements describing the devastating effect that Jennifer's disappearance had had on their lives, their marriage, and their ability to enjoy the achievements and milestones that should have brought happiness during their retirement years. The trial attracted significant media attention throughout Texas and nationally, with journalists and true crime enthusiasts following developments through social media and traditional news outlets that provided daily coverage of witness testimony and legal arguments. The case was featured on several television programs devoted to cold cases and forensic science, with experts discussing the advances in DNA analysis technology that had made Sullivan's identification possible, and the importance of preserving physical evidence for future analysis using techniques that had not yet been developed. The trial became a symbol of hope for families dealing with long-term missing person cases and demonstrated the importance of persistent investigation and scientific advancement in achieving justice for victims of violent crimes. The prosecution's case included compelling testimony from forensic scientists who explained how advances in DNA analysis technology since 2000 had made it possible to extract reliable genetic profiles from evidence that had been considered too degraded for testing when it was originally collected. Expert witnesses described the statistical improbability that the DNA found on Jennifer's car belonged to someone other than Sullivan, concluding that the genetic evidence provided overwhelming support for his involvement in her death. The prosecution also presented evidence showing that Sullivan had provided false information about his activities and whereabouts during the crucial time period when Jennifer disappeared. Maria Santos's testimony provided devastating insight into Sullivan's personality, behavior patterns, and psychological state during the relevant time period. Maria described Sullivan's escalating violence and substance abuse during 2000, his obsession with controlling and punishing women, and his detailed knowledge of remote locations where bodies could be disposed of without discovery. Maria also testified that Sullivan had made specific threatening comments about dealing with women who he believed had insulted or rejected him, and that he had seemed unusually agitated and paranoid in the weeks following Jennifer's disappearance, avoiding his usual hangouts and becoming violent when questioned about his activities or whereabouts. Construction workers who had been employed with Sullivan during 2000 testified about his inappropriate behavior toward female co-workers and his disturbing comments about women he observed while working in downtown Waco. Several witnesses described incidents where Sullivan had made lewd remarks about young women walking past construction sites, had taken unauthorized breaks to follow women to their cars or workplace entrances, and had boasted about his knowledge of where bodies could be hidden in rural areas. The witnesses testified that they had been uncomfortable with Sullivan's behavior, but had not reported it to supervisors because such conduct was often tolerated in the construction industry and because Sullivan had threatened co-workers who questioned his activities. Former co-workers also testified about Sullivan's access to company vehicles and equipment during evening and weekend hours when he was not officially scheduled to work, access that would have allowed him to transport Jennifer's body to remote locations and bury her remains using heavy machinery without creating suspicion among supervisors or other employees. Several witnesses described Sullivan's habit of using company vehicles for personal activities and his knowledge of security procedures that would have allowed him to access equipment yards and vehicle storage areas without being detected by security systems or night watchmen. The prosecution presented telephone records showing that Sullivan had made numerous calls to Jennifer's office and cellular phone numbers during the weeks preceding her disappearance, calls that corroborated Jennifer's roommate's testimony about anonymous survey calls that had made Jennifer uncomfortable. Phone company records showed that the calls had been made from payphones and temporary cellular phone accounts that Sullivan had established using false identification, demonstrating planning and premeditation that supported charges of kidnapping and murder rather than spontaneous violence. The prosecution argued that Sullivan's telephone harassment campaign proved that he had been stalking Jennifer for weeks before her disappearance, and that her murder was the culmination of a deliberate plan rather than a random crime of opportunity. Expert testimony about criminal psychology and predatory behavior patterns helped the prosecution explain how Sullivan's documented activities fit established patterns of escalating criminal behavior that typically precede violent attacks on women. Forensic psychologists testified that Sullivan's surveillance activities, telephone harassment, and collection of personal information about potential victims represented classic warning signs of dangerous predatory behavior that would naturally progress to more serious criminal acts if not interrupted by law enforcement intervention. The experts explained that Sullivan's behavior demonstrated the type of planning, obsession, and dehumanization of victims that characterized the most dangerous sexual predators and serial offenders. The prosecution's case also included testimony from investigators who had spent decades working on Jennifer's case and who described the exhaustive efforts that had been made to identify potential suspects and explore alternative theories about her disappearance. Detective Chen, now retired, testified about the thoroughness of the original investigation and the persistent efforts that had been made to follow up on tips, analyze evidence, and coordinate with federal and state agencies that might have relevant information about Jennifer's case. Chen's testimony helped demonstrate that Sullivan had not been identified as a suspect due to inadequate investigation, but rather because the forensic evidence necessary to connect him to the crime had not been available until recent advances in DNA analysis technology. The defense called character witnesses who testified about Sullivan's reputation as a reliable worker and his lack of serious felony convictions, emphasizing his decades of steady employment and his role as a father who had maintained regular contact with his daughter despite his divorce from her mother. Defense witnesses included supervisors who described Sullivan as a competent employee who had completed construction projects safely and on schedule, neighbors who had never observed obviously threatening or disturbing behavior, and family members who testified about his commitment to supporting his daughter financially and emotionally throughout her childhood and adolescence. Defense experts challenged the prosecution's DNA evidence, arguing that the genetic sample was too old and potentially contaminated to provide reliable results, and suggesting that the laboratory procedures used to analyze the evidence might have produced false positive results due to cross-contamination from other cases or improper handling protocols. Defense witnesses included forensic scientists from universities and private laboratories who testified about the limitations of DNA analysis technology and the potential for errors when dealing with degraded biological samples that had been stored for extended periods. These experts argued that the statistical calculations used to demonstrate the uniqueness of genetic profiles were based on assumptions about population genetics that might not be accurate for all ethnic and geographic populations. The defense also presented alternative theories about Jennifer's disappearance, suggesting that she could have been the victim of random violence committed by transients, serial killers passing through the area, or individuals involved in drug trafficking operations that were active in Central Texas during 2000. Martinez argued that the investigation had been inadequate in exploring these alternative possibilities, and that the focus on Sullivan was the result of confirmation bias and pressure to solve a high-profile cold case rather than genuine evidence of his guilt. The defense suggested that Jennifer's body could have been transported to its burial location by someone other than Sullivan, and that the DNA evidence could have been planted or transferred through secondary contact rather than direct involvement in the crime. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on charges of murder and aggravated kidnapping, concluding that the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Sullivan had killed Jennifer Hartwell during the commission of a kidnapping in June 2000. The verdicts were announced on April 3, 2025, with Sullivan maintaining his innocence and shaking his head as the jury foreman read the guilty verdicts on all charges. Members of the Hartwell family embraced each other through tears as they realized that more than 24 years after their daughter's disappearance, someone would finally be held accountable for her death. The jury's decision was influenced by the overwhelming strength of the DNA evidence, the credibility of Maria Santos's testimony about Sullivan's behavior and psychological state during the relevant time period, and the prosecution's demonstration of Sullivan's opportunity and access to the location where Jennifer's body was discovered. Jurors later commented that they found the defense's alternative theories unconvincing, and that Sullivan's changing stories about his activities during the crucial time period demonstrated consciousness of guilt that supported the prosecution's case. Several jurors noted that they were initially concerned about convicting someone based on evidence that was over 24 years old, but that the scientific testimony about DNA, analysis and evidence preservation had convinced them that the genetic evidence was reliable and conclusive. Judge Michael Thompson sentenced Kevin Sullivan to life in prison without the possibility of parole, describing his crime as representing a calculated and predatory attack on an innocent young woman whose life had been filled with promise and potential. Judge Thompson noted that Sullivan had used his knowledge of local terrain and his access to construction equipment to commit and conceal his crime, taking advantage of the trust and safety that young people expected to enjoy in their communities. The judge also ordered Sullivan to pay restitution to the Hartwell family, though he acknowledged that no amount of money could compensate for their loss or the decades of uncertainty they had endured. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Thompson specifically addressed Sullivan's claims of innocence and his attempts to blame others for Jennifer's murder, stating that the evidence presented during the trial clearly demonstrated his guilt and that his continued denials showed a lack of remorse that made him unsuitable for any form of mercy or consideration for early release. The judge noted that Sullivan's decades of predatory behavior toward women and his deliberate concealment of Jennifer's body had caused immeasurable suffering for her family and had denied them the opportunity to properly mourn her death and celebrate her life through appropriate funeral and memorial services. The conviction of Kevin Sullivan led to renewed investigation of other unsolved disappearances and attacks on young women throughout Central Texas, using information from his interrogations and evidence found in his possession to identify potential connections to additional crimes. The Texas Rangers established a task force to review cold cases from the 1990s and early 2000s, focusing on incidents that occurred in areas where Sullivan had been working or living during the relevant time periods. The investigation remained ongoing as investigators worked to determine whether Sullivan might be responsible for other crimes that had never been solved due to limited forensic evidence and investigative resources. Preliminary investigation of Sullivan's potential connection to other cases revealed disturbing parallels between Jennifer's disappearance and at least 3 other unsolved murders of young women in Central Texas between 1998 and 2003. These cases involved similar victim profiles, comparable circumstances, involving women who vanished after leaving work or social events, and burial locations in rural areas that would have been accessible to individuals with construction industry knowledge and equipment access. Investigators were working to obtain court orders for DNA testing of evidence from these additional cases, though the results were not expected to be available for several months due to the complexity of genetic analysis and the limited resources available for cold case investigations. Thomas Hartwell, despite his advanced age and declining health, used Sullivan's conviction as an opportunity to advocate for improved missing person investigation procedures and better coordination between law enforcement agencies handling cases that might involve transportation across county and state lines. Hartwell testified before the Texas legislature about the challenges faced by families dealing with long-term missing person cases and the importance of maintaining evidence in storage conditions that would preserve forensic value for future analysis using advancing technology. Hartwell supported legislation providing additional funding for DNA testing and for training programs that would help investigators utilize new technologies and databases for solving cold cases. Hartwell's advocacy efforts resulted in the passage of the Jennifer Hartwell Missing Person Investigation Act, legislation that required Texas law enforcement agencies to implement standardized procedures for evidence collection and storage in missing person cases, and that provided funding for periodic reanalysis of genetic evidence using advancing forensic technology. The legislation also established requirements for coordination between agencies when missing person cases might involve multiple jurisdictions and created specialized training programs for investigators handling complex disappearance cases. The law became a model for similar legislation in other states and was credited with helping solve several additional cold cases through improved investigation procedures and evidence analysis protocols. Patricia Hartwell established a scholarship program at Baylor University in Jennifer's memory, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in business, marketing, and communications, with special preference given to young women from small Texas communities who demonstrated the same ambition and community service commitment that had characterized Jennifer's life and aspirations. The scholarship program was funded through donations from Jennifer's sorority sisters, former classmates, and community members, as well as through proceeds from a memorial foundation that the Hartwell family established to support missing person advocacy and victim services organizations throughout Texas. The scholarship program attracted national attention and generated significant donations from individuals and organizations that had followed Jennifer's case through media coverage over the years. The program's first recipients were honored at a ceremony held at Baylor University's Business School, where speakers described Jennifer's academic achievements, career goals, and community service activities, while encouraging current students to pursue their aspirations with determination and optimism. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of Jennifer's former classmates, professors, and community members who had maintained their commitment to her memory throughout the decades of uncertainty about her fate. The Baylor University community organized a memorial service for Jennifer Hartwell, following Sullivan's conviction, providing an opportunity for alumni, faculty, and current students to honor her memory and acknowledge the impact her disappearance had had on campus. Safety awareness and procedures. The service was held at Waco Hall, where Jennifer had attended business classes and student organization meetings, and it featured speakers who described her academic achievements, community service activities, and the positive influence she had exercised on friends and classmates during her time at the university. The service also recognized the importance of campus safety education and the need to balance personal freedom with awareness of potential risks facing young adults. The memorial service included the dedication of a new campus safety center named in Jennifer's honor, a facility that provided education about personal safety, crime prevention, and emergency response procedures for students, faculty, and staff. The center offered programs about recognizing and responding to threatening behavior, maintaining awareness of personal surroundings, and utilizing technology and communication tools to enhance personal security. The center also maintained a resource library about missing person cases and provided support services for individuals who had been affected by violent crimes or who were dealing with anxiety about personal safety. The apartment where Jennifer had lived during her final months in Waco was eventually converted into a memorial space by the property management company, which worked with the Hartwell family to create a small garden and seating area where community members could reflect on Jennifer's life and the importance of supporting families affected by violent crimes. The memorial features Jennifer's favorite flowers and a bench with a plaque describing her achievements and aspirations, serving as a reminder that young people deserve to pursue their dreams without fear of becoming victims of predatory violence. The memorial also includes information about campus safety resources and missing person reporting procedures, helping to educate visitors about steps they can take to protect themselves and their loved ones. The construction site where Jennifer's remains were discovered was marked with a memorial plaque honoring her memory and recognizing the importance of the highway workers whose diligence led to the discovery that finally brought justice in her case. The Texas Department of Transportation designated the area as a memorial rest stop, providing travelers with information about missing person awareness and the importance of reporting suspicious activities to law enforcement agencies. The memorial serves as a reminder that Jennifer's case was solved through the combination of advancing forensic technology, persistent investigation, and the alertness of workers who recognized the significance of what they had discovered. The Rest Stop Memorial includes educational displays about missing person statistics, safety tips for travelers, and contact information for reporting suspicious activities or potential evidence related to unsolved crimes. The memorial has become a popular destination for true crime enthusiasts and missing person advocates who visit the site to honor Jennifer's memory and to raise awareness about the thousands of individuals who disappear each year without resolution. The memorial also serves as a training location for law enforcement officers, learning about evidence recognition and crime scene processing, helping to ensure that future discoveries of potential evidence will be handled properly and that families dealing with missing person cases will receive the thorough investigations they deserve. On the 25th anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, June 15, 2025, the Hartwell family held a private ceremony celebrating Jennifer's life and the justice that had finally been achieved through Sullivan's conviction. The ceremony was attended by investigators, prosecutors, Baylor University representatives, and the many friends and classmates who had maintained their commitment to Jennifer's memory throughout the years of uncertainty. Thomas Hartwell, speaking with assistance due to his age and health challenges, thanked everyone who had never stopped believing that the truth could be discovered and that justice could be achieved, even after nearly 25 years of uncertainty and disappointment. The anniversary ceremony included the announcement of additional memorial and educational programs that would be established in Jennifer's honor, including an annual conference on missing person investigation techniques that would bring together law enforcement officers, forensic scientists, and victim advocacy organizations from throughout the United States. The conference was designed to share information about successful investigation strategies, advances in forensic technology, and support services for families dealing with long-term missing person cases. The conference was expected to become an important resource for improving missing person investigation procedures and for maintaining hope among families who were still searching for answers about their missing loved ones. Today, Baylor University's Business School features a conference room dedicated to Jennifer Hartwell's memory, providing students with a professional space for presentations, networking events, and career development activities, while being inspired by Jennifer's dedication to academic excellence and her commitment to using business skills for community improvement. The room's walls display photographs of Jennifer during her time at Baylor, along with examples of her academic work and descriptions of the marketing projects she had planned to pursue in her professional career. The memorial serves as a reminder that talent and ambition can inspire others even when life is tragically cut short, and that the pursuit of justice and truth can honor the memory of those who are no longer able to achieve their dreams. The Jennifer Hartwell Memorial Conference Room has become a popular venue for business school events and activities, hosting guest speakers, student organization meetings, and career development workshops that reflect Jennifer's interests in entrepreneurship and community service. The room includes technology and presentation equipment that enables students to develop the same types of marketing and business skills that Jennifer had been excited to apply in her professional career, helping to ensure that her passion for business excellence continues to influence future generations of Baylor University graduates who will carry forward her commitment to using their talents for positive community impact. The conviction of Kevin Sullivan closed one of Central Texas's most enduring missing person cases, providing closure for the Hartwell family and demonstrating that advances in forensic science and persistent investigation can bring justice even in cases that seem impossible to solve due to the passage of time and the degradation of physical evidence. Sullivan's life sentence ensures that he will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people, while Jennifer's legacy continues to inspire positive change through scholarship programs, safety education initiatives, and advocacy for improved missing person investigation procedures. Though Jennifer's life was tragically brief, her impact on others continues to grow through the educational and memorial programs that resulted from her case, proving that hope, determination, and the pursuit of justice can triumph over even the most devastating crimes and the longest periods of uncertainty. The resolution of Jennifer's case also provided important lessons for law enforcement agencies about the importance of preserving physical evidence for future analysis using technologies that might not yet exist, and about the value of maintaining active investigation of cold cases even when initial efforts prove unsuccessful. The case demonstrated that forensic science continues to advance in ways that can provide new opportunities for solving old crimes, and that families and communities should never abandon hope that justice can eventually be achieved for victims of violent crimes. Jennifer's case has become a symbol of perseverance and hope for thousands of families dealing with missing person cases, proving that truth and justice can prevail even when the path forward seems impossible to navigate. YouTube description: Texas girl vanished in 2000. Arrest shocks community after 24 years. In June 2000, 23-year-old Jennifer Hartwell disappeared after leaving her job in downtown Waco, Texas. A recent Baylor University graduate with dreams of starting her own marketing firm, Jennifer had just been promoted and was celebrating with friends when she vanished without a trace. Her car was found abandoned in a strip mall parking lot, but Jennifer seemed to have disappeared into thin air. For over 2 decades, her fate remained a mystery that haunted her family and the Baylor University community. Detective Sarah Chen led an exhaustive investigation, exploring every lead from workplace connections to potential serial killer links, but the case went cold despite a $100,000 reward and national media coverage. In October 2024, construction workers making a shocking discovery along Interstate 35 finally provided the breakthrough investigators needed to solve one of Central Texas's most enduring cold cases. Advanced DNA analysis and genealogical investigation led police to Kevin Sullivan, a highway construction worker who had been hiding in plain sight for 24 years. Sullivan's arrest sent shockwaves through the Waco community, where he had worked for decades. His ex-wife's testimony revealed a disturbing pattern of violence and obsession with attractive young women. The prosecution's case included compelling DNA evidence, witness testimony about Sullivan's predatory behavior, and proof of his access to the remote location where Jennifer's body was found. This is the complete story of Jennifer Hartwell, a bright young woman with unlimited potential, whose life was cut tragically short, and the relentless pursuit of justice that finally brought her killer to account after nearly a quarter century.